Imagine a world where your voice didn't matter. A world where your identity was tied to the men around you, where your legal rights were almost non-existent. A world where even when grave injustices were done to you, the compensation went to your father or your husband. Not to you could you survive in a society like that. What if this was your reality in a Germanic tribal assembly around 550 AD? Number 9. No seat at the table. Imagine for a moment the crisp, cool air of a Germanic tribal assembly, perhaps somewhere deep in the forests of what we now call Germania, or on the shores of a newly settled land in Britannia, or even within the fortified walls of a Frankish settlement in Gaul. The sun maybe casts long shadows as men, strong and bearded, cloaked in furs and wool, gather in a wide circle. They are the warriors, the chieftains, the elders, the free men who hold land and wield swords. They speak in low, guttural tones, then rise to shout their opinions, their voices echoing through the clearing. They debate, they decide, they dispense justice, they declare war or peace, they elect leaders. This is the heart of tribal power, the pulse of the community, where every significant decision is made. And where are the women in this powerful gathering? They are conspicuously, utterly, and systematically absent. This wasn't just a casual omission. It was a fundamental pillar of the social structure of the era. Women were by custom and often by emerging legal codes excluded from direct participation in these crucial assemblies. They did not sit in the councils, they did not speak in the debates, and they certainly did not cast votes. Their physical absence from the assembly was a powerful symbol of their political marginalization. The assembly, known by various names, such as the Thing among the Norse and Anglo-Saxons, or the Malice among the Franks, was an exclusively male domain. It was the arena where the collective will of the free men was expressed and enforced. For a woman to attempt to speak or even to attend as an equal would have been an unthinkable transgression of social norms. This exclusion wasn't due to a lack of intelligence or capability on the part of women. It was deeply rooted in the prevailing patriarchal mindset that defined the roles of men and women within Germanic society. Men were seen as the protectors, the warriors, the public decision-makers, the holders of Wergeld, a concept of man price, or the monetary value of a person's life, implying their standing in society. Women, on the other hand, were primarily defined by their roles within the household and family. Their contributions, while vital for survival, managing the home, raising children, preparing food, crafting goods, were considered private and domestic, not public and political. The assembly was the ultimate public forum, and therefore it was not their place. Consider the practical implications of this exclusion. If a woman had a grievance, if she had been wronged, if her family needed support, she could not directly present her case to the assembled men. She would have to rely on a male relative, her father, husband, brother, or even a grown son to speak on her behalf. Her voice was literally channeled through another. This meant that the strength of her argument, the urgency of her plea, and the very perception of her plight depended entirely on the oratorical skills, the influence, and the willingness of her male advocate. If he was unpersuasive, uninterested, or simply lacked the standing, her concerns might be dismissed out of hand. This created a profound power imbalance, where women were dependent on male intercession for even the most basic forms of public justice or representation. Historians who study early medieval Germanic law, like those who analyze the complex provisions of the Salic law, the Ripuarian law, or the early Anglo-Saxon codes, consistently find no mention of women participating in these assemblies. The very structure of these legal documents reflects a society where legal agency and political power resided firmly with men. The laws describe how men deliberate, how men vote, how men witness, and how men make decisions. The absence of women in these descriptions is not an oversight. It is an accurate reflection of their societal position. This exclusion from the most fundamental political institution of their time meant that women had no direct say in the laws that governed their lives, no direct voice in the matters of war or peace that might take their sons and husbands, and no direct input into the allocation of resources or the establishment of social norms. Their marginalization was of social norms. Their marginalization was abso norms. Number 8. Legal guardianship as a lifelong burden. Imagine being an adult, perhaps even a mature woman with years of experience and wisdom, yet legally considered a perpetual minor. This was often the reality for women in Germanic tribal societies around 550. Add, from the moment of her birth to her final breath, a woman was typically under the legal guardianship, or mund, of a man. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a deeply entrenched legal principle that dictated nearly every aspect of her life, profoundly limiting her autonomy and her ability to act independently in the eyes of the law. This concept of guardianship was a constant, unbreakable chain that tethered women to male authority, systematically undermining their individual legal standing. In her childhood, a girl was under the mund of her father. He was her legal protector, her representative in any dealings with the outside world, and the one responsible for her well-being and her actions. When she married, this guardianship having transferred from her father to her husband. It wasn't a transition to independence, but merely a change of overseer. The husband acquired the mund over his wife, meaning he was now legally responsible for her and had the authority to make decisions on her behalf. This included controlling her property, representing her in legal disputes, and being held accountable for her actions. If a woman was widowed, the mund might then transfer to an adult son, a brother, or even another close male relative, such as her father-in-law. There was rarely, if ever, a point in a woman's life when she was considered a legally independent agent, free from the mund of a male relative. This constant state of guardianship had massive implications for a woman's legal capacity. She could not, for instance, typically enter into contracts independently. If she wished to buy or sell property, even if it was technically her own dowry property, her guardian usually had to approve the transaction and often sign off on it. She could not initiate legal proceedings on her own behalf. If she had been wronged, say, someone had stolen her possessions or assaulted her, she could not march into the assembly and demand justice. Her guardian was the one who had to bring the complaint, speak on her behalf, and negotiate any settlements or penalties. The legal system was designed to interact with male heads of households, not with individual women. Consider the everyday realities this imposed. A woman might possess significant personal wealth, perhaps an inheritance from her mother, or valuable tools and animals she had worked hard to acquire. Yet, she could not freely dispose of these assets without the consent and involvement of her guardian. This wasn't just about large land transactions. It could extend to smaller, everyday agreements. Her legal persona was subsumed within that of her guardian. This meant that while she might have significant influence within her private sphere, her public and legal actions were always mediated and controlled by a man. Historians and legal scholars delving into the early Germanic laws consistently highlight the concept of mund as a cornerstone of their social structure. Works like the Salic law explicitly detail the responsibilities and rights associated with mund, always defining it as a male prerogative over a female. This pervasive legal dependency fundamentally limited women's agency. It meant that their voices were muted in the legal arena, their economic actions constrained, and their personal autonomy severely curtailed. They were seen as needing protection and guidance, not as self-sufficient individuals capable of navigating the complex legal landscape on their own. This perpetual state of legal guardianship was a pervasive form of marginalization, boxing women into a position of perpetual legal subservience. Number 7. Property rights is a puzzle of limitations. Imagine working tirelessly, contributing to your family's wealth, perhaps even inheriting valuable items, only to find that your ability to truly own, control, or dispose of that property is constantly in question, hedged by complex rules, and ultimately tools. This was the intricate and often frustrating reality for women concerning property rights within Germanic tribal societies around 550. While it's a common misconception that women owned no property at all, the truth is far more nuanced, and those nuances reveal profound layers of marginalization that restricted their economic independence and societal power. Their property rights were less about outright ownership and more about a limited right to use, often under male supervision, rendering their economic standing perpetually precarious. The core issue wasn't a complete absence of property. Women often brought a dowry or dose to a marriage, which could include household goods, tools, animals, and sometimes even land. This dowry was theoretically hers, intended to support her during the marriage, and, in some cases, to revert to her if she became a widow. Additionally, women might receive mourning gifts from their husbands the day after the wedding as a sign of appreciation and as a provision for her future. They could also inherit property from their mothers or other female relatives. So, women certainly possessed assets. Critical marginalization lay in the control and disposal of these assets. While the dowry was technically hers, its management almost invariably fell to her husband. He would use it for the benefit of the household, and his control over it was often absolute during the marriage. She couldn't simply decide to sell a piece of land from her dowry or use its proceeds without his explicit consent, which, due to the concept of mund or guardianship, he legally held over her. The husband had the usufruct, the right to use and enjoy the profits of her property, even if she retained titular ownership. This meant that while she might be the owner on paper, she lacked the practical power to leverage that ownership for her own independent economic gain or security. Inheritance laws further complicated matters and often favored male heirs. While daughters could inherit certain types of property, especially movables like jewelry or household goods, the transmission of crucial assets like land was typically skewed towards sons. The Salic law, for instance, famously excluded women from inheriting Salic land, which was often interpreted as the most important family lands that provided military service and formed the core of the family's power. While the interpretation of Salic land is debated by historians, it generally points to a clear preference for male succession in the most significant forms of property, ensuring that power and influence remained within male lines. If a woman did inherit land, it was often tied to conditions or managed by male relatives, again denying her full independent control. Even for property women gained through their own labor, such as specialized crafts or agricultural produce, their economic activities were usually subsumed within the household economy, managed by the male head. They couldn't operate as independent economic agents, entering into large-scale trade or business dealings without their guardian's approval. This meant that wealth for women was often a matter of possession rather than empowered control. It was a means of sustenance and support, but not a source of independent power or social leverage in the wider community. Their economic activities were tethered to the domestic sphere and ultimately controlled by male authority, preventing them from accumulating independent wealth that could translate into public influence or autonomy. This intricate web of limitations on property rights ensured that women, despite potentially possessing assets, remained economically dependent and thus marginalized in the wider socio-political landscape. Number 6. Marriage as a transaction, not a partnership. Imagine your entire future, your place in society, and your personal autonomy being determined by a single event that you have very little, if any, say in: your marriage. For women in Germanic tribal societies around 550, marriage was far less about personal affection or an equal partnership, and far more about a formal transaction between two families, a strategic alliance, or a means of transferring guardianship. This fundamental understanding of marriage as a property transfer, rather than a union of equals, profoundly marginalized women, turning them into valuable commodities in a larger familial and political game. Their bodies, their fertility, and their labor were the stakes negotiated by men. At its core, a Germanic marriage of this era was often a contract negotiated between the prospective groom and the bride's father or guardian. The bride herself had little to no say in the matter. She was usually expected to acquiesce to her father's choice, understanding that her compliance was part of her duty to her family and tribe. Terms of the marriage, including the dowry, the property the bride brought with her, and the bride price or wergeld, a payment from the groom's family to the bride's family, compensating them for the loss of a valuable member and symbolizing the transfer of her guardianship, were all hammered out by the men. The woman herself was a central figure in the transaction, yet she was largely excluded from the negotiation process. This transaction meant that a woman's value was often assessed in terms of her family's social standing, her potential for childbearing, especially sons, and her ability to contribute to the household economy through her labor. Her personal desires, her intelligence, or her individual spirit were secondary, if considered at all. She was in essence a pawn in a larger game of alliances, land consolidation, and strategic partnerships between male-led households. Chieftain might marry off his daughter to secure a peace treaty with a rival tribe, or a farmer might seek a bride for his son who came from a good family and possessed valuable skills for managing a homestead. The woman's role was to fulfill the purpose of this alliance, not to forge her own path. Upon marriage, the woman effectively moved from the mund, guardianship, of her father to that of her husband. This wasn't a transition to independence. It was a shift of ownership, so to speak. Her husband now held legal authority over her labor, and her fertility. Her identity became inextricably linked to his. This meant she often adopted his family name, joined his household, and her public standing became a reflection of his. If he was a man of high status, she gained respect by association. If he was poor or dishonored, her own standing suffered. She was a reflection of her husband rather than an independent entity. Consider the consequences of this contractual view of marriage. If the marriage failed, perhaps due to infertility or irreconcilable differences, the woman's position was incredibly vulnerable. She might be sent back to her father's household, potentially disgraced, and her bride price might have to be returned. Her future depended entirely on her family's willingness and ability to take her back or to arrange another marriage. She had no independent means of supporting herself or asserting her rights within the fractured relationship. This transactional nature of marriage, where women were exchanged and managed by men for larger familial and societal gains, was a pervasive form of marginalization, stripping them of agency and reducing their personal aspirations to secondary concerns in a male-dominated world. Number 5, the dehumanizing nature of property damage. Imagine being the victim of a heinous crime, something that violates your very personhood, causes immense physical and emotional suffering, and yet, in the eyes of the law, your pain is secondary. Instead, the focus is on the damage done to the man who owned you. This was the deeply unsettling reality for women in Germanic tribal societies around 550 AD when it came to instances of sexual violence, abduction, or even physical assault. These acts, which would be considered grave crimes against an individual today, were often treated not primarily as offenses against the woman's body or autonomy, but as property damage or an affront to the honor and property of her male guardian. This legal framework was profoundly dehumanizing and a stark marker of women's marginalization. Let's unpack what this meant. If a woman was abducted, raped, or even seduced without the consent of her family, the legal response primarily revolved around the payment of a wergold or a fine. But this payment was not made to the woman herself. It was made to her father or her husband, her legal guardian. Compensation was understood as a payment for the loss of a valuable family member, for the damage to the family's honor, or for the theft of potential offspring. It was akin to compensating a man for the theft of his livestock or the damage to his crops. The woman's body was viewed in a legal sense as a possession, and the crime against her was framed as a violation of her guardian's property rights or his social standing. Consider the Salic law, one of the most prominent early Germanic legal codes. Contains numerous provisions for fines related to violence against women. For example, the fine for the abduction of a free woman might be substantial, but the text makes it clear that this fine is paid to her male relatives. There isn't an explicit recognition of the woman's individual suffering or her violation as the primary injury. Her role in the legal proceedings was largely passive. She was the object of the crime, not the primary injured party in terms of receiving compensation. This legal framing stripped away her individual agency and reduced her to an item of value that could be harmed rather than a person with inherent rights and inviolable bodily autonomy. This perspective had profound social and psychological consequences. It meant that a woman's sense of self-worth could be tied to her unblemished status as a possession. If she was sexually assaulted, even against her will, she might be considered damaged goods, making her less desirable for marriage and potentially bringing shame upon her family. The focus was on the male honor that had been violated, rather than the profound trauma experienced by the woman. This created a double burden for victims, not only enduring the horrific act itself, but also facing potential social ostracization or diminished value in the eyes of her community. Furthermore, the emphasis on financial compensation to the male guardian meant that justice for the woman was often overshadowed by economic considerations, might be more concerned with securing the proper payment or restoring their honor than with the well-being of the victim. This system effectively condoned violence against women by placing a price tag on it, rather than condemning it as a fundamental assault on a human being's rights. This legal dehumanization, treating women as property whose damage required compensation to their male owners, stands as a particularly stark example of their systematic marginalization in early Germanic societies. Number 4. Inheritance laws, a skewed lineage. Imagine being born into a wealthy family, seeing vast lands and valuable treasures, yet knowing that your gender almost certainly means you will receive only a pittance, or perhaps nothing at all, compared to your brothers. This was a pervasive reality for women concerning inheritance in Germanic tribal societies around 550 AD. While absolute exclusions were rare for all types of property, inheritance laws were consistently and systematically skewed to favor male heirs, particularly when it came to the most valuable and significant assets like land and leadership. This structural bias ensured that wealth, power, and societal influence primarily remained within male lines, further marginalizing women from economic independence and perpetuating their dependence on men. The cornerstone of this marginalization lay in the concept of patrilineal succession, meaning that inheritance largely flowed through the male line. When a father died, his sons were typically the primary beneficiaries of his estate, especially his land, which was the bedrock of wealth, status, and military capability in these agrarian societies. Daughters, even if they were older than their brothers, often received significantly less, or were only entitled to certain types of movable property like household goods, livestock, or a share of the morning gift from their husband. The idea was to keep the land and the family's core assets intact and within the male lineage, ensuring the continuity of the male-headed household. One of the most famous examples of this gender bias in inheritance is the aforementioned Salic law's exclusion of women from inheriting Salic land. While scholars debate the exact meaning and scope of Salic land, it is generally understood to refer to the most important family lands, those that might have been tied to military service or formed the core patrimony of the family. Regardless of the precise interpretation, the provision clearly reflects a societal preference for male succession in vital resources. Even if a daughter did inherit land under specific circumstances, such as the absence of male heirs, her control over that land was often tenuous. It might be managed by a male guardian, or she might be pressured to marry a kinsman to keep the land within the broader family unit, effectively preventing her from truly controlling it independently. Consider the economic implications. If a woman couldn't inherit significant land or wealth, her economic future was largely dependent on her marriage. Her dowry, while providing some security, was controlled by her husband. Her prospects for accumulating independent wealth were severely limited. This meant that she had little economic leverage to assert herself or to live autonomously. Her value became tied to her ability to secure a good marriage and to contribute to her husband's household rather than her own independent financial standing. This created a cycle of economic dependence that reinforced her marginalized position in society. Furthermore, inheritance laws also shaped the nature of family power. Since land and other significant assets largely passed to sons, it meant that the heads of households, and thus the leaders of the community, were almost exclusively male. Women, even if they came from powerful families, rarely inherited the kind of wealth that would allow them to establish their own independent households or wield significant public influence. Their role was to marry into another powerful family, thus strengthening male-led lineages rather than establishing their own. This systemic bias in inheritance laws was a powerful tool for maintaining a patriarchal social order, ensuring that economic power and social status remained largely out of women's direct reach, cementing their marginalized status within the tribal structure. Number 3. Witness limitations. Their word weighed less. Imagine stepping forward to tell your truth, to offer crucial testimony in a legal dispute, only to find that your words are inherently devalued, seen as less reliable, or outright dismissed simply because. This frustrating reality was a significant form of marginalization for women in Germanic tribal assemblies around 550, and while women were not entirely excluded from being witnesses in all circumstances, their testimony was often viewed with suspicion, given less weight than that of a man, or even disallowed in certain critical legal proceedings, reflecting a pervasive societal distrust in their public credibility. Primary reason for this limitation stemmed from the general legal concept of a woman being under mund or guardianship. Since she was not considered a fully independent legal agent, her testimony was often seen as inherently tied to the interests of her guardian, her father, husband, or other male relative. It was believed that she might be unduly influenced by him, or that her words might not be her own independent legal declaration. This contrasted sharply with the testimony of a free man, particularly one with land and status whose word was generally accepted as weighty and independent. In many Germanic legal codes, such as the early Frankish laws, specific rules often dictated who could serve as a witness in different types of cases. While women might be permitted to testify in matters directly concerning the domestic sphere, such as disputes over dowries or the ownership of household goods, their role in more serious public crimes or land disputes was often restricted. For instance, in some situations, a certain number of compurgators, oath helpers, who swore to the veracity of a party's claim, were required. These compurgators were almost invariably free men, underscoring the idea that only men possessed the full legal credibility to swear solemn oaths in public legal contexts. Consider a scenario. A woman might witness a violent altercation or a theft. Her account could be vital. However, when it came to presenting this in a tribal assembly, her male guardian would likely have to present her testimony for her, or her testimony would be viewed with inherent skepticism by the assembled male jurors or decision makers. They might demand corroboration from male witnesses, or her testimony might simply be considered insufficient on its own to carry the day. This meant that even when women possessed crucial information, their ability to directly and effectively contribute to the pursuit of justice was severely curtailed. This limitation on women's testimony was not just a procedural detail, it was a profound symbol of their marginalized status. It implied that their capacity for objective truth-telling in the public sphere was inherently compromised. It suggested that their voices, even when speaking truth, lacked the gravitas and authority of a man's. This further entrenched the idea that the public arena where justice was dispensed and laws were upheld was a male domain, and that women's voices were best confined to the private sphere. By systematically devaluing their testimony, Germanic tribal assemblies ensured that women had limited means of independently influencing legal outcomes or holding others accountable, reinforcing their subordinate position in the justice system. Number 2. The silence of public influence. Imagine being a brilliant strategist, a skilled negotiator, or a compelling orator, yet finding yourself consistently shut out of any formal forum where your talents could shape public opinion or influence communal decisions. This was the pervasive and subtle marginalization faced by women in Germanic tribal societies around 550. Add the complete lack of a public voice and formal influence. While women might wield significant informal power within their households and kin groups, their ability to translate that influence into direct public action or policy-making in the wider tribal assembly was virtually non-existent, confining them to the shadows of power. The very structure of Germanic society, with its emphasis on male warrior culture and the assembly as the primary decision-making body, systematically excluded women from public life. Their roles were rigidly defined as domestic. They were the homemakers, the child rearers, the managers of household resources. These roles were vital for survival and were deeply respected, but they were not considered public in the same way as warfare, hunting, lawmaking, or leadership. The public sphere was where men demonstrated their prowess, where reputations were forged, and where power was exercised. Women simply did not belong there. This meant that even powerful women, the wives of chieftains, the mothers of prominent warriors, or women from wealthy families, could not directly address the assembly, negotiate treaties, or lead military campaigns. While a queen might exert considerable influence over her husband behind closed doors, or a respected elder woman might offer private counsel, these were informal channels of influence, not direct exercises of public power. Her influence was indirect, reliant on her ability to persuade a man who did have a public voice to act on her behalf. Her words could shape a decision, but they could not be the decision themselves. Consider the contrast. A male warrior could rise in the assembly and eloquently argue for a raid, or a chieftain could proclaim a new law. Their words carried the weight of their standing and their direct participation. A woman, no matter how unchiful, could not command that same platform. Her insights, if they were to be heard at all, had to be filtered through a male mouthpiece. This severely limited the scope and direct impact of any influence she might possess. It also meant that issues predominantly affecting women, or perspectives unique to their experiences, were rarely, if ever, directly articulated in the public forum, leading to laws and decisions that primarily reflected male priorities and perspectives. This systemic silencing was not merely a matter of custom. It was reinforced by the deeply ingrained patriarchal beliefs of the time. Qualities associated with public leadership, strength, martial prowess, oratorical skill in public debate, and legal knowledge were all male-gendered. Women were associated with nurturing domesticity and piety, especially as Christianity began to spread. This division of roles, while perhaps creating a complementary balance in some respects, also created an impenetrable barrier for women seeking to exert direct public influence. Their voices, however wise or urgent, were simply not considered appropriate for the public stage, ensuring their perpetual marginalization from the formal levers of power and decision-making in the tribal assembly. Number 1. The unforgiving weight of disparate punishments. Imagine living in a society where the same crime, committed by a man or a woman, resulted in wildly different consequences, with the woman often facing harsher penalties, social ostracization, or even death, while the man might escape with a mere fine. This stark imbalance in punishments was a particularly brutal form of marginalization for women in Germanic tribal societies around 550. It wasn't just about different types of crimes. It was about the underlying double standards rooted in societal expectations of female chastity, male honor, and the control of female bodies, making women disproportionately vulnerable to severe legal and social retribution. One of the clearest examples of this disparity revolved around sexual offenses, particularly adultery. While it's true that in some Germanic codes, fines were levied against adulterous men, the societal and often legal consequences for women were far more severe. For a woman, adultery was not just a breach of a marital contract. It was a profound violation of her husband's honor, his property rights, and the perceived purity of his lineage. It could lead to immediate repudiation by her husband, social disgrace for her entire family, and in some more extreme or unchristianized contexts, even the death penalty at the hands of her husband or male relatives. Accounts from historians like Tacitus, describing earlier Germanic customs, hint at scenarios where adulterous women might be publicly shamed or even executed by their husbands, though by 550 with the spread of Christianity, such extreme forms might have become less common, but the underlying societal condemnation receded first. For men, while adultery might incur a fine, it rarely carried the same level of existential threat to their social standing or their life. A man's honor was not solely tied to his sexual fidelity in the same way a woman's was tied to her chastity. His status was more deeply rooted in his warrior prowess, his wealth, and his leadership within the community. This double standard meant that women bore the immense burden of upholding familial honor through their sexual conduct, a burden that men largely did not share. Any perceived transgression on their part could lead to catastrophic personal and social ruin. Beyond sexual offenses, other crimes also reflected this gender bias. While property crimes or violent assaults might have specific Wargeld fines for both men and women, the context and social impact often differed. A woman committing theft might be seen not just as a criminal, but as someone who had shamed her guardian, potentially leading to additional family-imposed punishments or increased scrutiny. Her vulnerability was compounded by her lack of legal independence. She couldn't simply pay a fine and move on in the same way a financially independent man could. Her punishment often involved public humiliation, loss of reputation, or further subjugation under her male guardian. This disparity in punishments was a powerful mechanism of social control, effectively policing women's behavior and ensuring their adherence to patriarchal norms. It instilled fear and reinforced the idea that women's bodies and conduct were subject to intense scrutiny and harsh judgment, far beyond that applied to men. The severe and often disproportionate legal and social penalties faced by women for certain transgressions served as a constant reminder of their marginalized status, underscoring their precarious position within a legal system that often saw them through the lens of male honor and property.